So everyone, thanks very much for joining us. I have Phillip Titus from Chappellet Winery. Phillip has been the winemaker for Chapalais for more than 30 years now. And so we're going to be discussing a number of things, including the history of Chapellet, a little bit about its inception and why they decided to locate on Pritchard Hill. And then we're going to be talking about the distinction between mountain fruit and valley fruit and the impact that has on the wines. We're going to talk a little bit about the viticultural practices for Chapellet. And then Phillip's going to be discussing the winemaking philosophy for Chapellet. Following that, we have an exciting virtual tasting for you with two wines from the outstanding 2018 vintage, the Cabernet Franc and the flagship Signature Cabernet Sauvignon. And then we're going to finish on an even stronger note with the Pritchard Hill Cabernet Sauvignon from the 2017 vintage. And so with that, Phillip, I think we'll turn things over to you. If you could please just briefly introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the history of Chapellet.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. And I love talking about Chapellet. I've spent, believe it or not, most of my life there at this stage. So it's kind of it's definitely in my DNA now. Chapellet, I went to UC Davis when I was 18 and studied winemaking. And I never thought it was strange at the time, because at 18, you're really not that smart. You get into school and you're like, well, I'll be a winemaker, whatever. I hadn't really thought about it that much. I come from a winemaking and grape growing family, so I guess that's where it all started. But I went to Davis and I kind of found myself, at 18 or 19, being interested in almost everything but winemaking for the first couple of years. And then as I got to be 20 or so and started getting into my upper division classes, though, I started thinking, this is really great. And this is, and I had the opportunity to work a lot in vineyards, because I grew up on a vineyard, and more than I really wanted to work in vineyards. But I did get the opportunity to work in a few wineries, and just as part-time jobs, from coming home from school, and really found it, just so exciting for some reason. Just the smells, and I think maybe some of those smells back then, they were probably vinegar, but it still smelled good. Old barrels and kind of musty cellars, but man, it was so romantic. I studied agronomy and viticulture and enology, and because I'd grown up in a vineyard, I think I really wanted to go into the winemaking part of it. I think by 18, I'd had enough of working in vineyards. But so my parents bought this land in the late 60s, and that was 1 year after the Chapelets bought their property on Pritchard Hill. So the Chapelets bought their property in 67, and they were coming from Los Angeles. Don Chapellet had a successful kind of a commercial food business. It started out as vending machines for fresh coffee, and then kind of just blossomed into all these other things. Maybe it was times, but my parents were they're the same age. Don Chapellet and my mother are the same age. They started looking for that kind of more rural agrarian life. And, there weren't a lot of great wineries in Napa Valley at that time. There was a handful, but, my parents drank Bordeaux. I know Don Chapellet collected Bordeaux and Burgundy, but it all ended up in Napa Valley. Napa was kind of king then when it came to Cabernet, and really still is today. Not that there aren't other great areas, but they came to Napa Valley because they were intrigued by Cabernet Sauvignon, even at that stage. So unfortunately, I never knew the Chapelets, because I grew up in Sonoma and went to school in Sonoma, and they went to St. Helena High. I did meet Don Chapellet when I got out of UC Davis. And honestly, I got out and Chapellet was advertising for cellar workers and assistant winemaker. And I applied for the job. Not a lot of competition, but I got the job, and then quickly worked my way up into assistant winemaker. Chapellet is really kind of the classic wine growing estate. It's very much like what you think of in Bordeaux, where you have relatively expansive vineyards, but Pritchard Hill is up in the mountains, and that's what, really differentiates it from Bordeaux. So it's the vistas and the hillsides and the plateaus and everything, and the vines. It's just so beautiful. And then being in this, in this kind of wooded hillside area. To me, when I first drove up to Chapellet, for one thing, you always think you're lost when you get to Chapellet. You really find out not till the very end that you're actually not lost. But seeing Chapellet and meeting Don Chappellet and seeing this beautiful, they built this 3-sided pyramid winery, which was, for 1968, that was incredibly avant-garde. And so, and it was called the Cathedral of Wine, at least locally, people kind of gave it that name. And it really still is a cathedral of wine. And so going in there at 22 years old and just going like, oh my gosh, I think I've arrived. And so in a way, I kind of had never left. I've grown with the estate. I've gotten to know the Chapelets. We've had common goals of taking Chapellet from this kind of rural vineyard and hillside, somewhat of an anomaly in the late 60s because there was very few hillside vineyards, and kind of, taken it to this, I think, like a world stage where, we're making wines that rival the best from Napa Valley and the best of Bordeaux and, from around the world, where we've kind of part of that community. And it's, fortunate that the Chapelets bought such a great piece of property because it made so many things possible.
Back in 1967, that was very, very early on in Napa's development as a wine growing region, certainly on the national stage. I think the Judgment at Paris was, 1976, so almost another decade later.
Yeah, and, Don, the story of Don Chappellet, there's a great story of Don Chappellet finding this property. He did meet with Andrei Chelyshev, who was a Russian guy, white Russian that came, left Russia after the revolution, and then he had studied agriculture and he was well educated, but he ended up in Italy and then farming and making wine, and then in France and being educated in France, and then he was brought to the United States by George Latour to be the winemaker at Beaulieu Vineyards. And so, there were not that many winemakers in Napa Valley with that kind of pedigree. And so he was brought because he already had a reputation in France. And so he came, and Don Chappellet sought his advice. Andrei Chelyshev told him, well, if you want to make these kind of Bordeaux, like Chateau Latour type wines, you're going to have to go to the mountain. And there weren't that many vineyards in the mountains. So he had to either plant one or buy one. And he found this vineyard, very young vineyard, had just been planted in 1964, almost 100 acres. And the funny part of it is that everybody tried to talk him out of it. Even the realtor, Don told great stories, and we would sit around and he would just say like, yeah, this realtor just kept saying, oh, you don't want that place. It's just, there's no water. It's going to be so expensive to grow the grapes, and there's like rattlesnakes all over the place and everything. And Don was like, well, I guess I don't want this. And then he went home and thought about it and goes like, no, I actually do want this. And so he went back to the realtor and said, no, let's take another look at this. That became Pritchard Hill. And Pritchard Hill is named Pritchard Hill after Charles Pritchard, who came from, I thought Pennsylvania, now I'm here in New York, but he came from a long ways away in the 1860s and ended up on the property there and had 300 acres. There's a little hill as you go up, and that's where the Chapelets have their home. And it's so that people think of the entire mountain as Pritchard Hill, but originally it was just this little hill. And that's where the name came from. And it was by Charles Pritchard naming it after himself and his family. And we still have the original house that he lived in. It's all been restored, and the old barns and things like that. So it's very historic. And he planted grapes there. I don't know how, because it feels like it's hard, like everything's working against us to grow grapes there now. It's so difficult. But he did it, back in the 1860s with very limited resources.
And so what was it about the hillside? Was it the soils that Mr. Chelyshev thought would be capable of producing fruit that would make wine that would be more analogous to Bordeaux?
Yeah, and I think it's the European notion of the vines needing to struggle to make great wine. And, there they have rain in the summertime. And so struggle there is probably different than struggle here, where we have no rain after most years after April, and certainly not after May. But it's the thinner soils, and we have a variety of soils, but a lot of them are these kind of red volcanic soils, really beautiful soils. We do have one area that's a little richer soil right around the winery. And I think that is probably what attracted Charles Pritchard there, because he knew he could grow something in this richer soil. But then after you get off of this little bench, then it goes up into the hills and it gets very rocky. A decent soil depth. It's not just like a foot of soil. There's like 2 or 3 feet of soil, but a lot of rock, well drained, and not all that fertile. It's not like the rich alluvial soils that you would find in the valley floor. So I think what you'd expect there to see is, kind of a smaller vine, a smaller stature to the vine, more openness, less leaves, more exposure of the fruit to the sun, potentially even overexposed, because of the difficulties. And so you get these kind of more, bigger, more tannic wines, getting earlier ripening, and just a lot of structure, a lot of color, a lot of tannin, a lot of this kind of rich graphite-y character. There's just something that comes from these mountain vineyards. It can be too much of a good thing if you're not careful, and that's one of the things that I've had to learn as a winemaker is you can over-extract grapes from Pritchard Hill and just have a wine that's just too big and too tannic and you'll never drink it. But that's kind of the thing that, the longevity of being there, we've learned to make these more balanced wines. But quality from the hills, it's a certain character. You don't want to say it's better than the valley floor, but it's different. But it's all about that kind of structure and then the longevity of the wines.
Right. And certainly there's more elevation as well. I understand that the elevation ranges from 800 to about 1,800 feet. Is that right?
Yeah, from our very first vineyards to the very top of Pritchard Hill, and we have vines almost to the top of, whatever we have vines above the old Pritchard Hill, the original Pritchard Hill. So what that does for us is, it took me a long time of being at Chapellet. At some point you go like, this is just an amazing place to grow grapes. But then, after a while you start kind of going, but why? What makes this kind of very reproducible, dependable, first growth, high quality vineyard? And then you start going over it and going, because you have to see enough different seasons to know that a great vineyard is a great vineyard essentially every year. And that's what makes it great. It makes great wine year in and year out. And that's what makes the top growths of Bordeaux. And so we have this soil that we talked about. We are on the east side of Napa Valley, which is the side that gets most of the sun. Even in the afternoon, as the sun goes down, it's still shining on our vineyards. And with these, we have a lot of west-facing, north and south, but always west-facing vineyards. So we get that sun accumulation. And then the elevation gives us a cooler day. We're above the fog. Napa Valley is very often just shrouded in fog, but we're just a little bit, it's like the fog comes right up to the beginning of our property and then stops. So we have more sun, but we get the cooling effect of the fog. We have a cooler day, but then a warmer night because the heat rises out of the valley. And that warmer night kind of pushes along the ripening because the vines are kind of more active metabolically longer through the day with that heat. So, we kind of start out a little bit behind the valley floor and other parts of the valley, and then we kind of catch up. And then our ripening kind of comes into focus at a very good time, late September, early October. We don't want to be trying to harvest in November, because as far as I can tell, nothing good happens in November when it comes to harvesting grapes. It's just too late and too cold. So it's this effect of kind of getting the best of both worlds. If you get too high in elevation, like the very top of Howell Mountain, it gets very cold, and it gets, on a cool year, hard to ripen those grapes. Coombsville, it's much cooler area, and you can sometimes deal with vegetative characters, pyrazines. So as I've seen, and it's not just me because I love Pritchard Hill, but I've seen the benefits of where this vineyard is, and you know what, other people have seen the benefits. Back when Don bought it, nobody really knew about it, but since then, people at great expense come to Pritchard Hill.
Yeah, it's definitely a popular area now, for sure.
Yeah.
And I understand that you manage the vineyard in individual blocks. There's 48 individual blocks. Is that right?
Yeah, 48. And, I think that as we've been replanting, there's probably a few more now because blocks get smaller as we learn more about the soil. The blocks get smaller rather than bigger because we look at all the individual aspects of the land and the soil. And if you make the block too big, you may have like one type of soil at one end and another at the other, and then they're all on the same irrigation system. So we try to break the blocks down into, whereas we used to have like 5 and 10 acre blocks, and most of our blocks now are about 2.5 acres, 3 acres, because it gets more consistent soil and aspect to the sun. Because if you're facing directly into sun is different than even tilting backwards a little bit away from it. And it's like, those are the things that we've learned over the years. And then that 2.5 or 3 acres gives us a solid 6 tons, 8 tons. And most of our fermenter size has gotten smaller too, because we used to have, all 10 and 12 ton fermenters. And now our average fermenter is probably 6 tons or 4 tons. We have some 8-ton fermenters, but we have gotten into that micromanaging, and we've rebuilt the replanted the vineyard and kind of rebuilt the winery around the vineyard. So the tank sizes now fit the vineyard block sizes, so we can keep everything separate.
So each block has fruit that's fermented separately as well.
Yeah, everything gets, nothing gets combined until we're ready. The vineyard is very dynamic because we've gone in and replanted it. I can think of blocks that were the foundation of the Pritchard Hill Cabernet in the 90s. Those blocks are gone now. They've been torn out. They get viruses. They get old, whatever. They're not producing. They get replanted. And then there's a period when the vines are young and the quality isn't as good. And then, then you have to kind of start the process over. And so it's very dynamic. We're learning a lot about different rootstocks, different clones of Cabernet. I used to hear about clones of Pinot Noir that sounded so exotic, and now I think there's more Cabernet clones. Well, I'm quite sure there's at least as many Cabernet clones as Pinot Noir clones, and so we're constantly trialing new clones. But that's a 30-year commitment every time you do it. So we're really fine tuning the vineyard and learning more as we go. We know so much more now than we did 30 years ago.
And the overall vineyard is around 104 acres planted. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a really nice size. I think the Chapalais are very good stewards of the land. Right now, everything's protected. It's very difficult to plant a new vineyard in the hills because everything you just can't go into a forest and bulldoze the trees. But back when they originally bought it, and probably up until about the late 80s, you could you just get a permit and then you just get a bulldozer in there and start taking out trees. Now you can't do that. But they never wanted to. They, Mrs. Chapellet and Don as well, they're just in love with the property. It's not just the vineyard. They love the whole property. And it's, where their children grew up, and, they, and their friends and their, employees are like family. So it's they've really taken very good care of this property. So they could have planted more, but I think they were very respectful of the property and didn't deforest it and plant more vines.
And they have other sustainable practices that they've implemented as well, and even achieved organic certification in 2012. Is that right?
Yeah, and organic certification is, we don't put it on the bottle. We talk about it, and we were very proud of it, but it's something that we did not as a marketing thing. They just felt it was the right thing to do. And many people farm organically, but don't take it to the full extent of becoming certified because it's not that easy, and it's a lot of paperwork. So there's a lot of people that go we'll just do it, but we're not going to get licensed to do it. But the Chapellet is just kind of, their belief, this kind of systematic way of being organic. Not that easy. We had one attempt at being organic, and the vineyard just looked terrible. And so we went back to traditional farming, and then we hired consultants to come back and teach us how to do it, because it just wasn't that easy to find the right level of compost. Because you really, you really have to build up the soil because you just can't put amendments in the soil and put them through the drip system and expect them to get to the roots like that week. You have to be constantly, we compost all of our grape skins and stems and seeds. They go into these big compost piles. They get spread back on the vineyard. We have cover crops. They do have fertilizers, organic fertilizers they can use. But it's a lot of work and it's actually a lot of expense too. So I think it's great that they didn't just kind of talk the talk. They really did it.
I understand there was a big solar project initiative as well. Solar power was implemented with the solar panels and so forth.
Yeah. And, if you look at an aerial view, if you go to the website and look at an aerial view, what's nice is that we have the old winery, that we call the Pyramid, and it's gorgeous. But we really outgrew it. It really, it wasn't meant to make. They thought they'd make about 5,000 cases of wine there. And then we're definitely making more than that now. But in 2011, we started, it actually takes years to build a winery just because of the permitting process. But we started building in 2011. We built a brand new state-of-the-art winery. And it's, with all the proper cooling and heating and humidification, all these zones that the barrels can be in so that the wine really ages at the, really the optimum temperature and humidity. But that's dug down into the ground and then with a flat roof. And so the entire roof of the new winery, which we call the Shea, is solar panels. We generate just about what we use, it works out pretty well. So I don't feel too bad about putting on the air conditioning.
Right. What about the cathedral building? Was that shortly after acquisition in the late 60s?
Yeah, that was built. You see the pictures. They're incredible because winery was designed, the Chapalais worked with an artist from Los Angeles that they knew, Ed Moses, and he came up with this design. And, they said, can you help us design something? And, he wasn't thinking about how much is it going to cost or anything. He's an artist, he's going to be like, well, we're going to make something beautiful. And so he designed this thing and they're like, okay, well, how are we going to make this thing stand up? And so they hired an engineer that later became an architect and became very well known in this area in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for winery design. But Chapellet was his first. And he came in and figured out how to get the pyramid to stand up. And it's like a ship. It's all built of wood, big beams. And like a ship, it always leaks. And we have really tried. And at this stage, we're down to we've almost rebuilt the winery. It's better now than when it was built. But it's taken us almost 50 years to figure out all the leaks. in this wooden pyramid. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there will ever be none, but we've just about got it down to no leaks. But it because those designs were, I think they were kind of winging some of the design.
Right. Yeah, probably so. One last question about the vineyard practices. What sort of cover crops are you using? Do you have some of the mustard? I've seen a lot of pictures of mustard lately.
Yeah, well, and February is the mustard month. This is it's if you think it's it's not here yet. When's it coming? It's the last part of February, and that's kind of when the valley is covered in mustard. But our cover crops are for two things. One is to prevent erosion, because Chapellet was one of the first wineries to use cover crops to prevent erosion in the hills. And now it's mandatory. Now you have to do it. And so there are grasses that are planted, usually fescue and bromes, that are planted as cover crops because they don't grow real tall and they seed early. So they grow up, they go to seed, and then you can mow them and then they'll regenerate themselves from the seed. So once you establish a good cover crop, it'll keep coming back. But, it is the mountains and things just grow a little bit wild. But The other way is when we're trying to build up a soil, we would use legumes. And when we plant that, all of a sudden you have peas, peas growing in the vineyard. And we don't keep doing that. Usually that's a period of time when the vineyard's being developed and we're trying to get those nitrogen rich cover crops in there. But it would be like clovers, vetch, bell beans, peas. And then we take that cover crop and till it back into the ground. It's like real traditional farming, to use a legume cover crop to add organic matter and nitrogen back to the soil and get the bacteria. And there's so many things that live in the soil. You don't even want to know what's down there, but they need to be there, even, fungi and things like that. And so all that organic matter really gets them growing.
Maybe we could shift gears a little bit and talk about your winemaking philosophy. What's your approach that you use at Chapellet, and how would you describe that?
Well, the philosophy has evolved. It's one thing to have a philosophy, but I always thought that, Chapellet, the hillsides especially, are not the easiest place to make wine, because that you have to kind of create the balance in the wines there, because the wines can be so big and concentrated and structured that if you're not careful, you get this, what we call is rusticity. So the wines can become rustic, they're like tannic, and people go like, oh, yeah, that's going to take 20 years. And it's like, that's not something I ever want to hear, is people saying, oh, that wine needs 20 years. Because then I'm like, oh man, that's kind of euphemism for, wow, that's way too tannic. But that's the way many of the early vintages were. But what we learned, I don't know if you've ever had the 1969 or 70 Chapelets, Cabernets, but they're like the quintessential Napa Valley Cabernets from that time, and some of the best wines ever made in California. The one thing that I learned back then, because I started there in 1981, is I could still taste those wines. Those wines were still around, and that our best wines were not the tannic wines, because then we had other very tannic vintages come along. And those were wines that were always like, oh my God, I want to drink this wine, but I'm just not enjoying it. It really does need time. And then you would look, so, the kind of thing where you take a wine and say, I love this wine, and this wine I'm not as in love with. And you go like, well, what is it about that wine? And the best wines, and the wines that really became the most famous for Chapellet, were not the more tannic wines. They were balanced wines, and they had beautiful color, plenty of tannin, moderate tannins, and just this balance and harmony. And so, I think it became our goal is to recreate that harmony in all of the wines. But it's not as easy as it sounds. And so as we started kind of delving into this, we started finding out that there are tannic wines that have very little tannin that taste tannic. They can be low tannin, but they're harsh. And then you can have wines that are full of tannin, just loaded with tannin and color, and they taste soft and rich and balanced. And you kind of go, well, that's the holy grail. That's where you want to be. That's that perfect wine, that perfect hillside wine. You can't just pull back, because then you kind of go into a place where the wines are not that interesting. When you make that balanced wine, you have to kind of go forward and go deeper into the wine, into the grapes and the extraction, but then be careful to not over extract, to get the good part and try to minimize the negative through much effort and research and everything. And we built up kind of a protocol that I don't expect anybody else to use, but this is like our protocol for Chapellet. And then we veer from this protocol a lot. But it's always based on getting to that rich, supple, dark, kind of velvety wine that has age-worthiness but is still pleasant to drink. And so it all is this balance of the right amount of tannin, which can be a lot of tannin, but if you're going to have a lot of tannin, you have to have a lot of color. Those two things kind of form molecules together that taste great. And so, that has been our philosophy. And we have just made a study of doing that, and then trying to make it reproducible, so that we don't have, we don't like this good vintage, bad vintage thing. That's not good. It's not good for the consumer. It's not good for us. It's not good for the business. you want like all great vintages, or, at least, reaching the bar that you've set. And so how we go about doing that is, it's just a matter of, getting the grapes to the right ripeness. It's a fermentation that does a lot of the extraction on the red wines. When they're still very sweet, we try to get a lot of the extraction before there's a lot of alcohol, because the more alcohol you have, the more extraction comes from the seeds and less from the skin. So we try to do more of a really thorough skin extraction, and then kind of stop before we really start overdoing it on the seeds, where you get those harsher, more astringent or bitter compounds. I can say, well, what have you been doing for the last, 35 years? That's pretty much it. Okay. I've been trying to figure this out.
Yeah, I know there was a time period early on in Napa, I think, where they were using Bordeaux as a model and harvesting much earlier than they do now, when the grapes were less ripe and then required longer to age. Is that?
Yeah, and take longer to age. But one of the great things about growing up on a vineyard is that, when I was a kid, there was very little irrigation that could take place. People just stuck, they had St. George rootstock, which is this bomb-proof rootstock. They'd stick it in the ground, they'd let it sit for a few years, bud it, and then they'd grow these vines, and a lot of them were dry farmed. But what happens with those dry farm vines is it's very romantic to think about not irrigating and everything, but if you have a heat spell like, 105 degrees, and those vines have not been irrigated since the last time it rained in April, they really stress out. And then people would really be more forced to pick because of the stress on the vine. They did, but so there was a culture of picking early, but I think that culture in many ways came from the vines did not have the stamina to get to 26 bricks. Because, they, by 23 and a half, 24 bricks, they were kind of done. And the vines looked at it like, dry leaves, yellow leaves, brown leaves, vine, fruit starting to shrub a little bit. And so, I think some people romanticize that time and think, oh, these people were so dedicated to picking early. It's like, in many cases, I don't think they had a choice.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. At what point do you blend the wines then? Could you describe your blending process?
Yeah, and that is the best part of winemaking, and I would never hide that. To the guys that I work with, it's when we start blending because you always start with the Pritchard Hill, because no matter what, the very best from our property will go or become eligible for the Pritchard Hill, and so you're just dealing with the very best lots, and so that it's our job is to really identify those lots, and they have to be identified. It's like they have to pass a number of different tests to be kind of like to get to the Pritchard Hill. They have to smell great, they have to taste great, they have to feel great. Then we also measure, we like looking at the chemistry, and we like to know like the anthocyanin levels and the tannin levels, and so like something has to be basically perfect to go into the Pritchard Hill. So we isolate those grapes first, or those wines first from a new vintage. And that would be, say we harvest in October, we start blending in February or March and start putting together that first blend. And the idea with blending early, and this is very much a Bordeaux model, they blend even earlier than us, is you take all these parts and put them together, and they form like a more stable unit. Because if you have, kind of softer wines and more tannic wines and wines with a lot of color, a lot of times those things are good, but not stable by themselves. And so it's better to put them together and form this very stable unit where all those, people talk about the élevage or the marrying of the lots. Well, it's better to marry them when they're younger and they're very reactive and they're still able to contribute to the qualities of the other lots. And so we try to get this Pritchard Hill pulled together that spring, the spring following the harvest. And that it takes longer than you'd think to do it, because we really just get so detailed, and nothing else can be blended until the Pritchard Hill is done. But then we go into we have a vineyard designate from the property called Hideaway that gets blended next, and then the signature Cabernet, and then it, so that it goes down the line. And we blend right up until the next harvest. And so we try to get about 80 or 90% of a blend done the first time. And then we put it back to barrels, get everything mixed together, put it down to the right oak, the right percentage and the right qualities of oak. And then things are pretty stable. And then they age through that next harvest. And that's when a lot of the kind of the magic is happening. It's kind of, we're off making another vintage, but the wine is coming together. When the following harvest is over with, then we go back and start looking at the blends we've made. But we've always left many little satellites, unblended, more Petit Verdot, some Malbec, some Tannic Cabernet, some soft Cabernet, some really colorful Cabernet, and so then we always have that ability to come back and tweak that 90% blend or that 80% blend. And then that's like the finishing touch. And so that's January, 2 Januaries after making it, December and January of the following year or 2 years, we're making those final things. We rack the wine one more time and do what will be essentially the final blend. And so then those are just coasting into to bottling at that stage. They'll have about 5 or 6 months before they're going to be bottled. And you've hoped you've made all the right decisions. And then you have one more little trick at the end is you're allowed to add up to 5% of the next vintage to a wine. That's legal. And it's a very good blending tool. Because that, we don't always use 5%, where, we might use like 2 or 2.5, but you go to your very, very best lot from the following vintage. It's like, you don't want to overdraft on your credit card, but you're kind of going in there and stealing a little bit from the future and putting it into that older wine. And that new wine sets the clock back on the older wine, brightens the color, and kind of like gives the wine the wine has an aged character, but it gives it back a little more of a youthful character. And so that's like the final little thing you do right before bottling is that little cherry on top, which could be a little bit of younger wine. But because these Cabernets age for almost 2 years before they're bottled, you have time. You have time on your side. So you want to get it right, and then you want to do the right things through that 2-year period. And our new winery, the Shea, the wines age at these very cold temperatures. They age very kind of like slowly, and it really preserves this freshness in the wine. So the wines, I must say, once we built that, it's like the wines have gotten even better just because of the facility.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. Well, should we shift gears and start the tasting?
Sure. Yeah.
I think, why don't we start with the Cabernet Franc? This is the 2018 Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, we're not the only ones. A lot of people plant Cabernet Franc, make this assumption that they're going to blend it with their Cabernet. It's done in Bordeaux. To me, the smell of Bordeaux is the smell of Cabernet Franc. California, I think Cabernet Franc is useful for blending with Cabernet, but certainly not in the levels that it's used in Bordeaux. So, you end up with this Franc and you go like, well, it's really good, but we don't want to blend it with the Cabernet. So, you kind of turn around and look at it on its own. And Cabernet Franc is very good by itself, but it's even better when it's blended with Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and Malbec and just maybe a tiny bit of Petit Verdot. And to me, that becomes where our wine starts smelling a little bit more like Bordeaux.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole process of blending Cabernet Franc is sort of like this. It's like the elegant wine, and you kind of have a softer touch with it. You're not trying to make a monster. You're not trying to make a wine that's going to age for 50 years, although it might age 20 or 30. But your goals are different with the Cabernet Franc. And the guys, I always say guys, I wish we had some women on our team, but we have one new, our cellar master is a woman, so hopefully she'll be tasting with us too. But the guys I taste with, I'm always saying, like, you just cannot have a tannic Cabernet Franc. There's just, it's a contradiction in terms. If you've got a tannic Cabernet Franc, we have not done our job. And so we always want this velvety, this velvety, rich wine that has all those, great aromas of Franc and then kind of added aspects of the other varieties. And it's a lot of fun to blend. And personally, I do think these wines age well in that kind of 20-year range. You'll open one of these and you just think, well, oh God, I better drink that. It's going to be getting old. And you go like, oh my God, it's alive.
Yeah, the aromatics on Cabernet Franc are always so distinctive. It's one of my favorite wines to try. And so often it isn't a blend, but when you get a dominant blend like this, really help to identify it when you go back to some other blends where it's a smaller percentage. But this one, I understand, is 75% Cabernet Franc, 15% Cabernet Sauvignon, 6% Malbec, and 4% Petit Verdot.
Yeah, and I'm glad that got it written down because, like I forget from year to year, like, what we did. But that's fairly typical blend. The higher percentage of Petit Verdot, that's probably the most Petit Verdot we would use. It's usually 2 to 4, but, that's one that you don't want to be too dominant in the wine because it kind of takes over. But that level of Cabernet and in many ways, except for the Malbec, because, even though Malbec is a Bordeaux variety, you don't see a lot of Malbec in Bordeaux. I think it grows better in California. I think the heat that we have during the growing season is more suited to Malbec because if we have a cold year and Malbec doesn't ripen perfectly, it's really not that good, and so it's I think it does well here, but not so much in Bordeaux. But, I think that you can imagine maybe if that Malbec percentage was Merlot, that would be a fairly typical Saint Estèphe or something like that.
Mm-hmm. A little bit of the floral lift, the violet, some black currant, red currant, some berries.
And for me, the richness, and there's a texture to Cabernet Franc. The tannin is just a little bit more velvety and almost like I used to say creamy, that kind of tannin that does it. It's there. It gives it structure, but very little astringency. It's unique to that variety, and it has a very specific kind of texture. And I love that texture and really want to maintain it in the wine.
And there's a little bit of herbaceousness, but it's certainly not overdone. It's more subtle, I think, maybe like a little bit of sage and thyme, things more like that nature, not like the bell pepper that you can get with some sort of Cabernet Franc. It's just a little subtle herbaceousness.
Yeah, I like that sage kind of aspect. I think of that like the bay leaf, the sage, the thyme, or, sometimes people talk about like the kind of marjoram or things like that. We use 60% new oak on this, and I really like then the way the oak spices mingle with the spices, the natural spices of the grape, and then the toast of the barrel give it that background like the coffee grounds, and so you get all those things kind of working together, and it becomes very complex. It's like you could just keep smelling and tasting this wine over and over and finding more things in it.
Absolutely, and it's evolved a lot since I poured it before we started as well. So
I could just guarantee that wine at 10, 8, at 10, at 12, at 20 years is going to be outstanding. It's because I've seen these wines. I've seen wines like this from the early 2000s or late 90s when we really didn't know where they were going. Wines like that just turn into like your favorite wine that you've got in your cellar. You're just, it's like, oh my God, this wine, once you realize what you have, but not everybody puts the Franc down to age. They're aging Cabernet and they're not really thinking about aging Franc. But I would suggest to anybody, if you have a full-bodied Cabernet Franc, put a few bottles away.
Yeah. Plus, it takes some self-discipline, which a lot of people struggle with as well, because it's so good right now. But
yeah,
it will keep getting better, I think, as well. So
off-site storage seems to be the best thing. It's not to have all your wine at your house.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, should we shift gears and talk about the Cabernet Sauvignon and start with the signature?
Yeah, and the signature. This is our flagship wine. It's the wine that we make the most of. It's the wine that represents all of the property that doesn't go into the Pritchard Hill Cabernet. or the hideaway, but it also represents some of our neighbors' vineyards. We as time's gone by, we've expanded, but we stay very close to home and buy from Stagecoach Vineyards and Cora Vineyards, Altimeter. They're right on that same area as Chapellet in the Eastern Hills. And so, I always think of this wine as having the DNA of the original 69 and 70 Chappellet Cabernets. Comes from the same property, has the same great structure and character of those wines. So it is, at one time we were probably blending more Merlot and Cabernet Franc into this. It's evolved almost every year, just based on blind tastings. It has evolved to being more Cabernet blended with Petit Verdot and Malbec. They seem to be the stronger blenders in Napa Valley now as time has changed and we've gotten better plant material and people have just gotten awareness of these. And so very consistently, our blends come back to something like this, a little bit of Petit Verdot, a little bit of Malbec, and about 85 or 90% Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah. And I did notice that the composition for this wine was identical to the Pritchard Hill. Is that intentional or was that just kind of a coincidence?
It's really a coincidence. And it's kind of like, I look at that and I think, well, because other years they're not the same. It's not like we just have a formula because that's, the one's an 18 and one's a 17.
Right.
But they are our favorites, and we're not the only ones. You see more and more of these varieties being blended with Cabernet Sauvignon. And, just briefly, the Petit Verdot is the dark fruit. It's the dark berry. It's the blackberry and cassis and these kind of mouth-filling tannins, big wine. And then the Malbec is more red fruited, very like dark cherry and lots of color, but very low in tannin in comparison. So you have these things you can build up and soften and do all of these things and kind of sculpt these wines with the other blending varieties. So it's our analogy is if you have a wall, before you paint it, you fill in the cracks with spackle. And, very often the Petit Verdot and the Malbec fill in all the cracks. And then it makes this beautiful, smooth texture and palate. And so, blending still my favorite indoor sport.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in this one, in my opinion, is always one of the best values in Napa as well. The retail price on this one, as I understand, about $70. Certainly for the quality that you're getting, it's a very, very compelling wine at that price. So I definitely highly recommend this one. It's drinking beautifully already. And this one too will age for many years. And I had just had the '09 Chappellet Signature Cabernet a couple months ago. And that one was in a great place right now.
Yeah, so. That was you did a tasting of 09s.
I did, 4 or 5 09s.
I was reading that, and those, that's it was never thought of as like a great vintage, but it's a very good vintage. But in retrospect, you look back and you're like, no, that really was a great vintage.
Yeah,
fantastic wines from 09. Well, do we have time to talk about the Pritchard Hill?
Absolutely, let's do it.
So the Pritchard Hill, this is where, it's the wine that we really grow why we grow grapes, what we're doing gets so focused on this, but what's good for the Pritchard Hill is good for the Signature too, because all of the grapes are farmed the same way and they have the same aspirations, but just the the cream that comes off the vineyard goes into the Pritchard Hill. And it is that real fine-tuned identification of the best lots, these sort of perfect lots. Usually when you've identified them, they, quality plus quality is quality. And you can, once you've identified these blocks, they can just be layered in on top of each other with some discretion, but we know the vineyard well enough. And once we see these lots, we know they're going to fit together. And they get more new oak. These are made in 100% new oak. They get finished at least by the first year in 100% new oak. And what I always think is interesting is that with all that oak, you can barely smell oak. Because the wine is so intense. It just like it's like the black hole that just absorbs things, and everything just goes in and becomes like a note of spice or a layer of chocolate or something, that, and the wine is so the depth is so great on it, and the texture is so broad and rich that the oak, without it, you'll notice that it's not there, but with it, you don't think of oak. And so it accentuates the wine. So it's a very special wine from a very special place. And I must say, I've been probably the luckiest person in the world to have opened up the St. Helena Star and answered an ad when I got out of Davis, completely broke and just needing money and going to work for Chapellet, because I've gotten to go on this great journey to making this wine. It all kind of culminates here with this wine.
Yeah, and this is always one of the highlights for the Napa wines every single year. Always at the very, very top in terms of quality. Very, very consistent. And like you said, there's no such thing as a down vintage. It's outstanding year after year after year. And you're right, it's very harmonious. You can identify descriptors and fill out a tasting grid, but it all just kind of blends together as a harmonious wine, even at this young age.
And like I was saying, it's not a tannic wine. It's got big mouth-filling structure, and you sense the density, but it doesn't have that, the dryness of that rusticity. And so that is the holy grail, and that is, like I say, like, what have you been doing for the last 35 years? Is pretty much just trying to figure out how to do that,
Yep. Yeah. Well, it definitely worked. Just like with filling the holes in the cathedral. Seems like you've gotten to the right point.
that might be our other masterpiece, is stopping all the leaks.
But I understand that for this wine, for people who are interested in obtaining it, the 17 is sold out, but the 18 is going to be coming out soon. And it's my understanding that to get that wine, the best way to do it is to go to the website and sign up for an allocation.
Yeah, we have a very good staff, and they'll get back to you and they'll help you with that, you don't have to buy a case. Wines like this, they're expensive and they're age-worthy, and you can start anywhere. You can start with a bottle. People
are interested in acquiring the other wines. You also have a membership club, I understand. There's a red wine club, for example.
Yeah. And so people can sign up, and we actually make wine, some from the property and some from the other vineyards, where we make wines that are specific to the club, like a Malbec, a Bordeaux blend. We make a Zinfandel from ancient Zinfandel vines on Mount Veeder, and so that we have these real specialty wines that if people want to sign up, if they like our style of wine and they like what we're doing and have enough confidence in us that we can kind of keep you pretty well entertained throughout the year. That we are super focused on Pritchard Hill, but we're branching out into other areas, always looking for quality. Same idea. We're always looking for family farmers, multi-generational vineyards and quality.
Are you open for in-person tasting and tourism opportunities now, or is that still a ways off?
You know what? It's open now. It's only been for a couple of weeks, and I think Napa is doing super well on the COVID numbers, and I think we're going to be indoors probably mid-March. Whether Chapellet will open up indoors or not, we've got so many wonderful places throughout the property that they've developed for, to take people. We get in these little Jeeps and Polarises and go out to these nice areas with beautiful views and everything. And they've set them up very well. So, just for that extra level of comfort and, distancing and everything. And we take people out there, we leave them with their wine, we don't pester them, and then, we come and check on them. And, from everything I've seen, people are thrilled with that opportunity.
Yeah, I did that myself maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's a fantastic visit and one I certainly highly recommend and remember to this day and hope to do again in the near future. So.
Yeah, the views, I think the Chapelets, when they bought the property, it wasn't lost on them that it was gorgeous and it has some of the most amazing views in Napa Valley.
Absolutely. Well, that's great that you're open again and people can visit. Certainly a hard year, but hopefully we're past the worst of it and can get back to business as usual a little bit.
There's that kind of optimism that's it's infectious. People are really ready to move on, and lots of vaccinations here. Agriculture, it's a priority to get the ag workers vaccinated first because, they're just like our first responders and medical professionals. ag, it's a very good place to start with the vaccinations, and the Napa has been very organized and lots of vaccinations going on, especially in the ag community.
Good. I wanted to ask you, even though I know the vintages are consistent from year to year, in terms of the overall history of the last 20 years or so, how would you compare the 2018 vintage to some earlier vintages? Is there any one or two vintages it's somewhat analogous to, like maybe '07 or 2012? Or
well, I was thinking seven. Even before you said it, I was thinking seven. Seven is a really very, very good vintage. I mean, if I was going to pick of this century, I'd probably go to '07 as the best, not just for Chapellet, but for other Napa Valley producers. They're just stunning wines, and they're aging beautifully, and they don't get smaller. They almost, like, as they age, they get bigger, and more complete. Yeah, 12 and 16, I think, are the benchmarks that I see being close to 18, and actually to look forward to. I don't like to just kind of buck the trend, but I think 19 is as good as 18, and maybe not for everybody, but for Chapellet, 19 is they're just beautiful, harmonious wines, and they're just delicious wines. And I think somehow 18 and 19, they just came like a package. We got both of them, and they're so high in quality and both very plentiful vintages. We have 18. There's a lot of fruit, and we thin our vineyards as much as we need to balance the vines. And in 18, our poor vineyard manager, Dave Perio, he was throwing so much fruit on the ground, and people were just like, Dave, are you sure? I mean, is that okay? Like, are you doing the right thing? And he kept saying to people, don't look at what's on the ground, look at what's on the vine. Because that's when it's right, is when the vine is in balance. What's on the ground doesn't matter. That's gone now. And so, but he took a lot of flack in 18 for having to drop so much fruit. And then in 19, less so. The crop was smaller in 19, but still very plentiful. So, even with the kind of the fires and things like that, we've had these two beautiful and very plentiful vintages that come along. So we're really not short on wine. We will be short eventually, but having these very abundant vintages has kind of bridged the gap for us.
What impact did you have from the fires?
17, not so bad, because it was almost the end of the season for us. There was some effect. And 20 there's not like a major silver lining, but a lot of the wines are still very good. We did make wine. We were very selective. You can actually test the grapes to see if they have there's an effect of the smoke, and we didn't harvest things that had smoke taint. So it's not a vintage that will have very much wine. It'll be very, very limited. The interesting things about 2020 is the white wines are just fantastic.
Oh, really?
Yes. It's Chardonnay, it turns out, is kind of bomb-proof when it comes to smoke taint. The skins don't the smoke does not go through their skins. There's no detectable smoke on our Chenin Blanc or on Chardonnay and most Sauvignon Blancs. They're just, you never even know there was a fire. And so there will be very good white wines and some very good red wines. It just kind of depends on where you were. It could literally depend on just which way the wind is blowing. If the wind, you can have a fire close to you, but if the smoke's going the other way, it's not affecting you. So it's all kind of microclimate and distance from the fires. But we're looking forward to some years now, some drama, a little less drama. But I don't know. We really don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, that's true. So, well, right now you must be in the middle of doing the blending and the tasting for the 20 Pritchard Hill then.
Yeah, and so we're kind of entering that phase and starting to, we'll start bottling the 19s, and it'll take us almost the rest of the season to bottle the 19s. So, and then the new vintage will hopefully be here before we know it, and we're off to a kind of a nice regenerative new start to winemaking. So really, everybody's just really excited about the prospects of a great year coming up.
Well, great. Well, I don't want to take too much more of your time. You've been very gracious and generous, and we've certainly learned a lot from you, and we appreciate you joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on. I love talking about Chapellet and our wines. We're very proud of them and everything. And, we want everybody, when you're comfortable, you'll be, if you come to see us, you'll be comfortable at Chapellet. We really are taking the extra steps and making it very safe and really enjoyable. It's a great place to be. It's a good place to kind of come and forget about everything else.
Absolutely. No, the scenery is incredible. The wines are top notch, and everyone there is a pleasure to be around. So I highly recommend it.
Well, I wish I had met you when you were there 5 years ago. But next time you come, make sure I know. I'm always kind of the lab, and where I hang out is in the back of the winery. You probably, as you walked out to the vineyard, you probably walked by the lab, and that's where we're back busily analyzing and tasting and doing what we do.
Yeah, excellent. I'll definitely plan on it and hope to get back there soon.
Yeah. All right. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you, and thank everybody for tuning in.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks very much, and have a good night.
All right. Talk to you later.
Okay.